Welcome back to In Your Right Mind with Dr. Tanmoy Sharma. I'm Stephanie Wilder Taylor. We're talking about patient brokering and many other problems in the behavioral health industry with our guests, Audrey Smith and Harry Nelson.
Harry, do you want to contribute to this conversation about the laws in
Sure.
Florida?
No, I thought Audrey did a good job of talking about some of the penalties for patient brokering and the applicability of the Telemarketing Act, and you brought up, Dr. Sharma, the deceptive marketing piece. To me, one of the most interesting pieces of the new Florida law is the whole issue around Florida model. So Florida model is what we commonly refer to in California and around the country, a model that emerged in Florida where essentially residents would be staying in unlicensed sober living facilities, and then they would be transported over to outpatient treatment programs. And so while that model emerged in Florida and while it's still widely used in California, it's now, as a result of this law, it's essentially illegal for there to be business relationships between unlicensed sober livings and outpatient programs. So it's really severing what has been a huge part of the industry. And the only way that there can be relationships after this law is if these sober living facilities actually formally go through a certification to be what's called certified recovery residences. And they have to meet standards, which is which is positive in the sense that it addresses some safety issues that had come up and forces the sober living facilities to meet standards in terms of respecting residents' rights. So anyway, it's kind of, I was saying, it's a little bit ironic that Florida model is no longer acceptable in Florida.
So Florida model is dead in the water in Florida. I just want to clarify for our listeners one small issue there. Is it the case that this is not legal anymore if the sober living is owned and operated by somebody else, or owned and operated by the people who have, say, a PHP or a partial hospitalization or an IOP, intensive outpatient license?
So there was an exception built into the law that's sunsetting for when there's a wholly owned facility, and there's Florida has a much more nuanced set of opportunities. There's a license in Florida for day-night treatment with community housing. Florida has actually done a much more rigorous job than the state of California of defining the categories. And so as a result, in Florida, you have to be very, very careful. The challenge that we see in California is that it's a lot more open-ended. We don't have any licensing requirement for the outpatient side. And so you have a lot of examples of an unlicensed sober living contracted with an unlicensed outpatient program or just a certified outpatient program. There's no formal rule on this in California. There now is essentially an exception that used to be in place that is sunsetting. So my suggestion for anybody who has both outpatient and recovery residences is that they should be ensuring that they're fitting into the licensing and certification requirements. It's a good time to double check that you're following the law.
Just going along that vein, I remember I had to go and do this whole Department of Justice fingerprinting for both the DCF and ACA. ACA gives you the mental health license. So they had quite strong checks and balances in place and security in place for licensing of addiction treatment centers. But Harry, there's nothing like that here in California.
Yeah, it's a widespread sort of question that's being asked is why California does not have similar requirements, for the drug and alcohol counselors, which are currently completely, sort of not certified at the state level, exclusively private organizations, private associations. And why there's no licensing for outpatient programs. There are tools that we have, the live scan fingerprinting that are widely used in other parts of the country.
Yes.
And I think it's an example of a lot of catch up that California has to do. And the big question that comes to my mind when we're having this conversation is whether California is going to do something that's as severe and draconian as what Florida did, or whether there's going to be a different approach here, because the Florida rules are very tough. And really, a lot of people are worried that those kind of requirements are coming to California in the near future.